The night had been billed as a historic gathering, a chance for two of the most prominent Democratic voices to stand side by side and discuss the challenges America faced. The auditorium was filled with anticipation, every seat taken, with crowds spilling into the aisles. The banners overhead read, "Voices for Justice," but no one in the room knew that what was about to unfold would be remembered less as a panel discussion and more as a showdown. Kamala Harris, the vice president, had entered the stage with her usual presence, confident, polished, and purposeful. She knew the cameras loved her, and she carried herself with the poise of someone used to leading from the center. But on this night, sharing the stage with Representative Jasmine Crockett meant the spotlight would not belong to her alone. Crockett, younger and fiery in her own right, walked onto the stage with calm confidence, and the audience greeted her with applause that seemed to carry an undertone of curiosity. How would this rising congresswoman measure up against one of the most seasoned figures in American politics? The event began with pleasantries, but almost immediately, the tension was palpable. Harris, framing her arguments around experience and the difficulty of governing at the highest level, positioned herself as the voice of pragmatism. Crockett, however, wasn't there to simply nod and agree. She fired back with sharp critiques, calling for bolder reforms and accusing the establishment of moving too slowly on issues that demanded urgency. The audience loved it. Every time Crockett spoke, heads turned, and bursts of applause followed. Harris' jaw tightened. For the first half hour, she tried to keep her tone professional, but the cracks began to show. The more Crockett challenged her, the more Harris leaned forward, interrupting, insisting that her experience gave her a perspective that could not be underestimated. Crockett, however, refused to be rattled. She smiled when Harris cut her off, waited her turn, and then countered with even more pointed words. Each time Crockett landed a line that resonated with the crowd, Harris' expression hardened further. Then came the breaking point. Crockett had just finished a passionate segment about accountability, stressing that even leaders at the highest levels must answer to the people. The audience roared in approval. Harris, standing beside her, raised her hand in frustration, her face flushed. And then, with no warning, her voice erupted into the microphone. "Enough," she screamed, her words reverberating like thunder. The sudden outburst startled the room into silence. Harris pointed directly at Crockett, her voice climbing higher with every sentence. She accused her of being reckless, of using words that endangered the fragile progress already made. "You don't understand what it takes to sit in the seat I sit in," Harris shouted, her tone dripping with exasperation. "You don't know the weight of responsibility, the constant battles, the impossible decisions." The force of her voice left the audience frozen, caught between disbelief and unease. Some in the crowd clapped nervously, unsure whether to support the vice president's outpouring or recoil from it. Others whispered, their eyes wide. It wasn't just that Harris was angry, it was the rawness of it. This wasn't the rehearsed, polished Kamala Harris people were used to seeing on television. This was a version of her that had lost control, revealing frustration that seemed deeply personal. Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and heavy. Jasmine Crockett, standing only a few feet away, didn't flinch. She didn't raise her hands or step back. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed calmly on Harris. The contrast was striking, the vice president shaking with anger, her voice booming across the hall, while the younger congresswoman stood grounded, her composure unshaken. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of the clash, knowing this was the moment the nation would talk about. The audience held its breath, waiting for Crockett to respond, unsure whether she would fire back or walk away. The silence that followed Harris' tirade was deafening, and in that silence, Jasmine Crockett's calm became more powerful than Harris' screams. The silence that settled over the hall after Kamala Harris' furious outburst was unlike anything the audience had expected. Moments earlier, the vice president's voice had been roaring, spilling over with frustration, echoing against the walls like a storm breaking loose. Now, with her words still lingering in the air, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. Harris' chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes still burning with intensity, as though she had just unleashed years of pent-up emotion. Everyone turned their attention to Jasmine Crockett, waiting for her to either retaliate or collapse under the sheer weight of the confrontation. But Crockett did neither. Instead, she calmly adjusted her microphone, her movements slow and deliberate, almost as if she were buying herself time. The crowd leaned forward. Harris had just screamed at her in front of the nation, how could anyone recover from that? Crockett's silence, though, wasn't weakness. It was power. She let the tension build until the room was begging for her to speak. Then, with a voice that was soft yet commanding, she began. Madam Vice President, Crockett said evenly, I respect your journey. I respect the seat you hold. But respect does not mean silence. Her tone carried no anger, no bitterness, just steady conviction. The contrast was stunning. Where Harris had roared, Crockett whispered, yet somehow her words carried more weight. The audience, still on edge, broke into applause almost immediately. Harris blinked, visibly startled by the younger congresswoman's poise. Crockett continued, her words weaving carefully between deference and defiance. She acknowledged the difficulty of Harris' role, the pressure of being in a position where every move was dissected, every word magnified. But then she pivoted, reminding the vice president, and everyone listening, that leadership was not just about enduring the burden, but about carrying it with grace. Passion, Crockett said, her voice firming as she looked directly at Harris, is not the same as power. True power comes from restraint, from listening when others are shouting, from building bridges when the easier choice is burning them. The hall erupted in cheers, the applause rolling like thunder this time, not hesitant but full. Crockett, still standing tall, didn't raise her voice to match the energy. She stayed calm, letting her composure itself become the statement. Harris' earlier fury now seemed almost out of place, overshadowed by the clarity and discipline in Crockett's response. The audience wasn't just listening, they were captivated, as if witnessing a moment that would echo far beyond this stage. Harris, still standing beside her, tried to regain her composure, her face struggling between defensiveness and disbelief. It was as though she hadn't expected Crockett to hold her ground so gracefully. Crockett pressed on, not gloating, not mocking, but dismantling Harris' attack with precision. Anger may win the moment, she said, her eyes sweeping across the audience, but calm wins the future. The words landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. People leapt to their feet. The crowd, which had been holding its breath only minutes before, was now roaring with approval. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed closer, and social media feeds across the country began to light up. Viewers watching at home would later say that Crockett had not only responded to Harris, she had redefined the entire exchange. By the time Crockett finished, the room was on her side. The applause lasted so long that Harris couldn't interject, her earlier thunderous presence muted by the storm of support for her opponent. When the cheers finally quieted, Harris didn't speak. She stood silently, her energy drained, her anger extinguished by the very thing she hadn't expected, a calm, deliberate, and unshakable reply. It was in that silence, as Crockett placed her hands together and offered the faintest smile, that the verdict was clear. Harris may have screamed, but Crockett had conquered. The headlines the next morning would reflect it, but the audience that night already knew, they had witnessed a moment where composure defeated chaos, and a calm voice stunned the nation into silence.